Hey everybody, Shoebox Legends here. Thanks for joining me today for the first installment in a new series of videos that I'm really excited to do for the channel. These are going to be called Hockey 101 videos. And here's the idea. So I've noticed, not surprisingly, that a lot of the YouTube sports card landscape is dominated by baseball. It's the most popular sport by far, and I collect baseball as well. I love baseball cards, but I'm also very passionate about hockey cards. And I want to do my part to kind of shine a better spotlight on the hockey card aspect of the hobby. So this is going to be a running series called Hockey 101, and each episode is going to get into a different topic related to the hockey card hobby to hopefully educate anyone who watches and myself, because unlike my usual style of videos where I'm kind of just off the cuff, I have put quite a bit of research into this and pulled a ton of cards and put some notes together so I don't miss anything. So I'm really kind of excited to bring this one to the channel. And some of these will be longer than others. Maybe I'll get into a particular player or set or year. Others may be shorter. Just a card that I think is cool or significant. But yeah, so Hockey 101. And for the first installment, the way my mind works, before I dive deep in on any topic, I like to get a broad kind of summary and sort of range or idea of what it is I'm looking at on the whole before I zone in on any one thing. So obvious first topic to me, and I put a lot of thought into this, was the history of hockey cards. And what I came up with was I basically broke down hockey card history into what I think are 5 logical eras of hockey cards. They've been around over 100 years now. And so I made some lines of delineation here and broke this into 5 chunks. And very curious to see if you kind of agree or disagree with my assessment. I'd welcome any comments or thoughts. Love hearing from all of you. And before we get started, I just want to give a quick disclaimer, as always, here on the channel. While I did put in a lot of research here, this is a fully analog production. I'm a one-cut, press the record button kind of guy. I've got some analog title headers here on the left that we'll be using to guide us through the episode. So the reason I mention that, if I omit anything or make any mistakes, take it for what it is. But I have put a lot of time and effort into getting this prepared, so I think I have most of this right. But if I leave anything out, feel free to, again, let me know in the comments. All right, so with that being said, 3-minute lead in, let's get into what I believe are the 5 eras of hockey cards. So hockey as a sport has been around for a long time, well over 100 years. Even the NHL in its different iterations and growths has been around for over a century now. And so too have hockey cards. And so in today's episode, as I said, I'm going to break down the whole 100+ year run of hockey cards into 5 eras. In the baseball card landscape, which I think a lot of us are more familiar with, you've got pre-war, which is obviously anything before World War II. You've got vintage, which is between pre-war and modern. You have ultra-modern, etc. And so I've tried to do something similar with respect to hockey cards. And in fact, the first era that we're going to look at, I did dub pre-war. And this is really any hockey card produced prior to 1950. So, with the emergence of the world from World War II and a new decade upon us in the 50s, production really ramped up in the hobby, and we'll get to that more in the next era. But in this first era, it's going to be anything that was produced prior to 1950. And so the earliest known hockey cards were produced all the way back in the early 1900s, 1910, between 1910 and 1913 by Imperial Tobacco. And they basically, here's an example. They produced, I think, 3 different sets in the early 1910s of hockey cards. They're very similar in size to like a T206. In fact, I think you can really associate these early hockey cards with T206 baseball cards. They're very similar, as I said, in kind of the artwork and the design, both released by tobacco companies and packaged with tobacco products for purchase. And so they share a lot. They're from the same era, early 1910s. And so yes, hockey cards do go all the way back to the, very early days of the 20th century, predating, even World War I. And those first 4 sets were produced by Imperial Tobacco, or 3 sets. And then from that point on, it was kind of spotty throughout the 20s and 30s, which is also kind of similar to baseball. There weren't hockey sets being produced every single year reliably from 1910 through 1949. That's just not the case. I'm not going to talk about all of the different random issues, local food issues and national issues that were produced during this 50-year period, because I want to keep this overall timeline to a reasonable length. This is probably going to be my longest YouTube video as it is. But a couple notable ones or examples that I have. In the year 1933, the brand O-Pee-Chee, which still exists in a different form in the world of hockey cards to this day, was introduced. So the 1933-34 O-Pee-Chee hockey set was their entry point into producing hockey cards. Have this really excellent condition Bun Cook here to show you, but just a cool card. I mean, condition aside, pretty neat to have something that's from the first ever O-Pee-Chee hockey set. And given their longevity as a brand, which we'll talk more about as this episode unfolds, they were probably the most significant brand to debut during the pre-war period with that 1933 set. They would continue to produce cards throughout the 30s, and then obviously during the 40s, the world was dealing with other problems and nobody was really focused on hockey cards. But the O-Pee-Chee brand does go all the way back to the early 30s. And then, as I said, there were other sort of offshoot and local brands, some up in Canada, like this one from Worldwide Gum, also produced in 1933. This is a Normie Himes Ice Kings. So there were a lot of different issues like this. And again, we're not going to get into all of those today in the interest of brevity and keeping this from being too long. But you can kind of compare a lot of these 30s brands to maybe like a Gaudi card. You can see kind of a similar shape and size here to a 33 Gaudi with this 33 Worldwide Gum Ice Kings. Different design, but so there was a lot of that going on throughout the 30s. Not really much of note in the 1940s. And so that's sort of the really brief, high-level overview of the pre-war hockey card period. It's definitely the period, with probably the fewest releases and fewest available cards out of all the 5 eras that we're going to talk about today. And that takes us to the second era that I've dubbed here, and that is the Parkhurst and Tops era. So this is where things change a little bit. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, coming into the 50s, there was sort of a renewed sense of global hope with World War II behind us and time for leisure and sport and getting back into things like producing sports cards. And in the same way that Bowman got rolling pretty heavily with baseball in the 1950s and was later joined by Topps, the second era, in the case of hockey, belongs to Parkhurst and Tops. And I would draw the line for this second era of cards from 1951-52 through 1963-64. So a little, 12, 13 year run here where the big guys in the game, the 2 licensed manufacturers of NHL trading cards, were Parkhurst and Tops. So Parkhurst came onto the scene first. And this is actually a card from the very first Parkhurst set in 1951, featuring Alexander Lund of the Boston Bruins. These are very, very small cards, miniature in size, full color front, and just a very basic card number and summary on the bottom, blank backs. And then throughout the 50s, Parkhurst continued to make cards. Their early 50s cards, here's a second year Parkhurst from 52 of Hall of Famer Milt Schmidt, and longtime Bruins captain and coach and executive. Again, very similar to like a 51, 52 Bowman in size. So I think of those early 50s Parkhurst cards very similarly to like this Billy Goodman 51 Bowman. Parkhurst you can kind of loosely associate with Bowman on the baseball side, which is something I'm going to try to do throughout this video, is kind of anchor these cards and these eras to like a more familiar sport like baseball. So think of Parkhurst like Bowman. They emerged on the scene in the early 50s. They started off making smaller size cards like that. But like Bowman, their cards actually became oversized later on in the 50s. So like these from the mid to late 50s kind of remind me a little bit of a 53 Bowman color. Another thing that changed during this period is Topps emerged onto the scene. So Parkhurst started in 51. Topps produced its first ever hockey set in 1954. And this is a 54-55 Topps Harry Howell. This is from the first ever Topps release. Oversized card, just like a lot of the Topps 50s baseball cards were in the mid-50s. And just beautiful. And then when Topps emerged on the scene, both Topps and Parkhurst actually took a break from hockey cards, each for like a year or two. And then they produced them again, starting in the mid to late 50s. And from that point on, with Topps on the scene, something changed. So when it was a Parkhurst-only world in the early 50s, they produced cards of all the players. So you could get a 51 Parkhurst like this of a Boston Bruin or a Montreal Canadian. You could get Gordie Howe with the Red Wings, but you could also get Rocket Richard with the Montreal Canadiens. Well, when Topps emerged on the scene in 1954, they sort of split the league. And what happened is Parkhurst would produce cards for the Canadian teams all the way into the early 60s. And Topps would produce the cards for the US teams. So you can't get like a certain years this changed. It wasn't always the case. But in some cases, you can't get a Parkhurst card of a New York Ranger, but you can get a Montreal Canadiens card. Or you can't get a Toronto Maple Leafs Topps card, but you can get a Boston Bruins Topps card. So they just kind of split the league in certain years during this era. Topps would produce for some teams and Parkhurst would produce for others. So pretty interesting. And the reason that this era ends after the 1963-64 issues is because that was it for Parkhurst in the hockey realm. They didn't make NHL hockey sets any longer after 63-64. So what happened at that point? Well, that takes us to our third of 5 eras, and that is the O-Pee-Chee and Topps era from 1964-65 through 1989-90. In my opinion, and again, everybody will see this differently, this is like the golden era of hockey cards to me, or the golden age of hockey cards, in the same way that the 1950s is for baseball to me. I say that because, a lot of the most memorable cards in the history of hockey came out during this era. Unlike baseball, there are cards, as we've seen, that go all the way back 100 plus years in the sport of hockey, but not all of them are notable or memorable. At least to like a casual sports fan. So a lot of the big cards that people think of when they think hockey cards came out during this 25-year stretch. Now, I probably should have called this the Topps and O-Pee-Chee era instead of the O-Pee-Chee and Topps. I probably should have led with Topps because at the beginning of this era, when Parkhurst was first out of the game, going into the 1964 season, it was only Topps. And for a 4-year run, from 64 through 67, Topps was the only one that produced hockey cards. And here's a 1964. So this is the first year of their 4-year run of exclusivity. And they did Tall Boys, which are just awesome. Love these cards. These are very, very similar to Tall Boy cards that you've seen in like basketball and football. In fact, they are nearly identical, or maybe identical, to the Tall Boys that were done in the very same year for football, 1964-65. It's a 64-65 card in hockey. And then here's a football equivalent that I happen to have in the collection just to kind of show you the crossover between the NHL and the NFL. But I love that, in their first year in a Parkhurst-free world, Topps at least took some chances. Those Tall Boy cards might not be for everyone. I personally love them, but at least it was something a little bit different. And Topps wasn't just playing it so safe. Continuing on, like the following year, they went back to normal size, but here's a 65. And at this point, as you'll note, because Topps was the only company in the business, they are back to producing cards for both the North American, the United States teams and the Canadian-based teams. So Topps was doing the full league at this point from 64 through 67 in the beginning of era 3 here. But then in 1968, we got Topps cards just like this one. Here's a nice Tim Horton, for those of you that are coffee fans, This one happens to be from the top set. You can see on the flip, 68 Tops. But in this same year, 1968, O-Pee-Chee began to issue sets that looked identical to the Tops release with some minor differences. And we'll talk more about those in a moment as we progress through this era. But starting in 68, you got 2 hockey sets every year, Tops and O-Pee-Chee, very close to the same set. But the basic idea was that the Tops cards were produced and sold in the United States, and the O-Pee-Chee cards were produced and sold primarily in Canada. So there's, the advent or the birth of O-Pee-Chee for the second time around. If you remember, they did do sets back in the 1930s, like we talked about with the first ever O-Pee-Chee set, but then they were gone from the hobby all the way until that 1968 release. From there on out, O-Pee-Chee was, the gold standard of hockey cards from 68 all the way through the end of this particular era, 1989-90. Tops and O-Pee-Chee put out some really memorable sets during this run. As I mentioned, here's a 71-72 Phil Esposito. I just always loved this design with the bubble lettering, just a classic. Of course, in my opinion, the single most iconic card in the history of hockey cards came out during this era. Again, that's why I refer to it as the golden era of hockey cards, but the Wayne Gretzky rookie came our way in 1979, 80, so that's great. And then, as I mentioned, the 2 sets that came out from 68 all the way through 89 were very similar, Tops and O-Pee-Chee, but there were some differences. And to kind of illustrate some of those, we'll look at a Gordie Howe card here from that iconic Gretzky year. This is his 1979-80 Tops with my beloved Hartford Whalers. And I also have the O-Pee-Chee version of this card. Card number is the same, as you'll see, number 175 on the checklist. Same image, same design, almost indistinguishable from the front. One thing that you won't see here with this comparison, though, is that the O-Pee-Chee set often had a larger checklist. So there would be extra cards at the end of an O-Pee-Chee checklist that did not exist in the top set. And that's important at some points during this era. But if we flip these over, you see the real difference. We have Tops on top, of course, and O-Pee-Chee on the bottom. And you can just see the difference with the brighter card stock that the O-Pee-Chee cards are printed on. Because of that, they're typically more valued and more prized by collectors. For cards like this, where you have a version of each, for almost the entirety of this era, the O-Pee-Chee card is going to sell for more money or be the more preferred card in the marketplace. That's just the case for most of these. And then the one exception to that, and this is a good way to wrap up era number 3, is the 1989-90 release. And this year, for whatever reason, Tops is more scarce than O-Pee-Chee, and Tops is the more valuable of the 2 brands in 89-90. And also, this is the final year of what I've dubbed Era 3, the O-Pee-Chee and Tops era. And why is, the line of delineation drawn at 1989-90? Well, because in 1990, the landscape exploded in the hockey card hobby. And I called this era brand explosion. And it's exactly what it sounds like. So kind of set the stage a little bit. In the world of baseball, it was a Tops world from the mid-50s all the way through 1980. And I talked about this in a recent video, so I'll just expand on it again here because it's relevant. But starting in 1981, you had Tops, but you also had Fleer and Donruss. The landscape had changed, and you had multiple licensed baseball producers. Then, there was further expansion throughout the 80s with Score, ultimately kind of culminating in the 89 Upper Deck Ken Griffey Jr. rookie, and that really ushered in a new era of cards, or of baseball cards, or in the baseball card hobby. Well, in hockey, the same process took place, and I'm going to get this one out of its wrapper here, but it took place much more rapidly than it did in the sport of baseball. So whereas in baseball, it was kind of a slow trickle through, the 80s of expansion, in hockey, as we saw, it was a Tops and O-Pee-Chee world all the way through 89-90, and then bam, 1990, immediately the scene exploded. You could still get O-Pee-Chee and Tops. Here's an example of a 90 O-Pee-Chee. They still made the flagship O-Pee-Chee and Tops set with this kind of classic hockey stick design. So that was still a thing. However, multiple other brands emerged on the scene in 1990 as the hobby really just took off in popularity. And for those of you who weren't collecting, this is right when I got into the hobby as a kid, winter of 89, spring of 90. The boom that existed in the early 90s was very similar in some ways to what we've experienced in the last, 3 years here during COVID, and, how the hobby has shifted and everyone just kind of went crazy about cards there. It might have even been more crazy and fervent in the early 90s, to be honest with you. I mean, card shops on every corner, card shows every weekend, everybody collected. You could get cards at the supermarket, the pharmacy, everywhere you were. It was just insanity. And, people recognized opportunity. And so other companies got into the game. We got Pro Set hockey cards. They had, emerged obviously in the world of football as well. But they gave us, starting in 1990, a hockey release. And they lasted, I believe, maybe 3-4 years. I think they eventually went bankrupt, before, eventually. But they did give us, as I said, 3 or 4 sets, including this inaugural one, which is sort of junk wax in the most extreme sense, but a beautiful looking set in my opinion. But that's definitely a topic for another video. Score emerged on the scene. So this is a card from their first ever hockey set, Jaromir Jagr rookie. But they had been doing baseball for a couple of years, since 1988. And again, just another company that saw opportunity in the NHL market and dipped their toes in this very same year of 1990. And of course, the big one that had the biggest impact on the hockey card hobby, and continues to this day, was Upper Deck. So they got in the game in 1990, a year after the baseball release that they did in 89, jumped in with a 90-91 hockey set, was wildly popular. They brought the same kind of crisp photography, hologram on the back, separate photo. This one doesn't have it, but a lot of the cards, second photo, full color backs, quality, gloss card stock, really just upped the game in the hockey card landscape in the same way that they did with baseball cards in 1989. And I think, maybe seeing them coming, or certainly knowing about a lot of the other competition, even Topps and O-Pee-Chee stepped up their efforts in 1990 to try to match and better their competitors. So we got, for example, O-Pee-Chee PreWar in 1990, brand new. This was marketed as a higher grade or, higher end product than a standard O-Pee-Chee card. The printing was supposedly more limited. Card stock is a better quality. Full color photographs on the back. So, Topps and O-Pee-Chee could definitely see what was transpiring, and to their credit, did make an effort to try to up their productivity. And then as this era wore on, because there was competition in the marketplace, we got a lot of cool, innovation throughout the 90s, just like we did in baseball with all the kind of wild, crazy design and stuff that went on. We got Dufex in hockey, and I mean, this card even has a Dufex back. Companies were just putting in so much effort to outdo each other. Serial numbered hockey got introduced. This is a card I actually just picked up within the last week or two. But, serial numbered out of 10,000. So serial numbering became a thing, and relic cards and autographs. And there are a lot of parallels between the way that the hockey card hobby grew throughout the 90s and early 2000s to the way that the baseball card landscape changed and grew. So that takes us, all the way through the early 2000s. You still had, in various forms, all these companies competing. Pro Set maybe dropped out and went bankrupt. Score started making Pinnacle, and Topps, came in and out, and they gave us Finest and, Topps Stadium Club, and just a lot of parallels to the world of baseball. Just, again, explosion of brands and ideas into the hobby. Then, unfortunately, the reason we draw the line of delineation at the 2004 season for this era is there was a lockout in NHL hockey in 2004. And the league missed the entire season. And after that point, when play returned, we were in what I deemed to be the 5th and final era in the hockey card hobby, the era of Upper Deck exclusivity. There is an asterisk there, you can see, which we'll talk about in a second. However, generally speaking, from the 2005 season on, coming out of the lockout, Upper Deck has been the sole licensed producer of NHL trading cards. It's an Upper Deck world that we're living in. If you collect modern hockey, there is no escaping it. You are going to collect Upper Deck. Whether it's flagship Upper Deck, and the Young Guns rookie, which has become kind of the cornerstone rookie card for any player, the Young Guns short prints in the Upper Deck flagship release. Or you don't collect flagship, but you get into other areas of the hobby. Almost any hockey card that you're picking up that's a significant modern card is produced by Upper Deck. Certainly if it shows any kind of logos or, you know, team information, it's an Upper Deck card. So it's an Upper Deck world for better than 15 years now, for better or worse. I think generally for worse. I'm going to save my opinions and deep thoughts on that for another day. But in general, I do think that, you know, competition breeds creativity. And I think monopolies and exclusivity kind of breed just lack of inspiration. And you've sort of seen a little bit of that with Upper Deck. Now, the reason there is an asterisk next to Upper Deck exclusivity is during this era, there was a brief 4-year period where another company got an NHL license, and it was granted to Panini from 2010 through 2013. So 4-year run before it was eventually revoked. We got licensed Panini hockey cards to go alongside the Upper Deck ones. And they did some really cool products in their limited run there. You know, we got Certified and Select and some of the brands that were kind of a throwback to the 90s. My personal favorite, which I've talked about on the channel plenty of times, they gave us a standalone Prism hockey release in 2013 with all the beautiful etching and colored cards. But again, only a 4-year run. They were out after the 2013 season, and then it was back to the world of Upper Deck that we are living in now. So, you know, Upper Deck it is. The Young Gun is the card. In my opinion, the two most significant cards, I've happened to show them on the channel before, that come out of Era 5 to date, 2005 to present, are the Alex Ovechkin Young Guns rookie, because in my opinion, he's been the best individual player in the league for about 15 years from his rookie season. And then this guy is kind of the heir apparent, and I know I'll get some grunts of disagreement, but Connor McDavid, his Young Guns rookie. So the Young Gun is king for the foreseeable future. It's an Upper Deck world. Who knows how things could change down the line. I mean, I doubt anyone could have predicted just a couple of years ago the craziness that would go on with, you know, Tops and Fanatics and all of that business. So it's really hard. Nobody has a crystal ball, but for at least the next little while, it is an Upper Deck world. And that's something that we'll explore more in future installments of Hockey 101. But for today, we're going to wrap it up there. I'm actually surprised I was able to do this in under 30 minutes. But this is going to conclude my brief overview of the history of hockey cards and what I would argue unofficially would be like the 5 eras of hockey card collecting. So as always, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I appreciate you watching. I do make an effort to respond to every comment left on the channel. I love the debate. As a lot of you know that can attest to, I can talk cards all day long and I never get tired of it. So would love to hear any feedback on this. And please keep your eye out if you enjoyed this for future Hockey 101 installments here on the channel. I will label them all very obviously as Hockey 101 right at the beginning. Whether you're a new collector or one that's been at it for a while, I hope you learned something or at least refreshed something in your mind that you maybe hadn't thought about in a while by watching this. Truly appreciate you giving 30 minutes of your time. With that, we'll kind of wrap this up. I'll be back with more content soon, but in the meantime, I hope everyone enjoys the hobby. Take care.